This is the Iron Sharpens Iron movement, sharing insights into the power of people-centric leading.
Hi, this is Jim, and today we welcome to our tribe the best-selling author of Screw Being Shy, a global top 100 podcast host of Humans 2.0, a featured member of Amazon Prime's The Social Movement, and an international speaker and social influencer, Mark Metry. The Iron Sharpens Iron movement is brought to you by N2 Growth, a leader in executive search, leadership development, and talent management. We find and develop the world's best leaders. Learn more about our practice by visiting us at n2growth.com or click on the link in the show notes of this podcast. Well, hi, Mark. Welcome to the Iron Sharpens Iron Leadership Podcast. We are so glad to have you here. And I will have to tell you, I'm a huge believer in fate and destiny. I believe that, people are here on this big old planet for a reason, and that each person's destined to do something good in their lives. And I will tell you, you are the ultimate example of that. In your time on Earth so far, you have really made a difference. And I think our whole audience is going to be really excited to have the conversation with you today. So again, welcome, Mark, to the Iron Sharpens Iron tribe.
James, thank you so much for having me. And, that's really what I think it is, man. I think that, whatever you believe in, whether it's God or a higher power, I really do feel like we are kind of given these raw resources, and then it's up to us on what we do with it. And some people can be given like the best hand, but they could, not go in the best direction, and vice versa. And so I appreciate that.
Yeah, you bet. And, for our listeners out there, just for the context of it, we're recording today on day 5 in the United States of our kind of stop movement actions during the coronavirus pandemic. So we have all of this hanging around us. And, Mark and I talked a little bit before we started the podcast on, should we address it? Should we not? And I think it would be foolish not to, because this is a global pandemic. The entire world is in essence shut down, and we're going to be in this for a while. And the lessons that you learn in a crisis are absolutely lessons that you can take forward in regular life. They're just amplified now. That's why they call it a crisis. So, Mark, I'd be really excited to know some of the things, just your perspective on what you've seen, kind of the resiliency of our globe and our nation and of people. And you wrote a really interesting post today in LinkedIn about now's the right time to be leading in the right ways. Could you talk to me a little bit about what you meant by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, a crisis can reveal a lot of things, but I think it can reveal, sort of a lot of our true behavior in ways that are both good and bad. And what I mean is now you see a lot of people who, whether it's they're freaking out at the grocery store because they're not finding enough supplies and they're maybe being rude to other people. And so we're sort of seeing this survival element kick up. And as we know, humans will sacrifice their values to meet their needs. And so that's one side
hierarchy. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one part of it. Yeah, that's exactly it. And so on the other hand, though, we're also seeing what leaders are doing and not doing. And oftentimes that, a lot of people who are maybe following someone on social media or not on social media, who they were following as a leader, now, either see them, maybe reacting to the situation in a way that's very negative, or just try to ignore everything that's going on, or not be a leader. And so I think through sort of leading by action, this is the ideal time to do that. And I feel like a lot of people in our society today are starting to realize who is a leader and who's not a leader. And so I think that gives ample opportunity for people who genuinely have the right intentions, the right values, and the right priorities to almost emerge and come out as leaders. And so
you bet.
That's what I'm trying to do to the best of my ability, whether that's, helping people through a variety of different ways. And so, in times of crisis and times of uncertainty, It's not like leaders have to know everything that's going on, but you do have to take sort of that courageous step forward and be like, all right, this is the situation that we're in. We could go plan A, and these are the pros and cons. We could go plan B. These are the pros and cons. Let's have a conversation about it. Let's try to unify people. And I know for me, like I live in Boston, and when the Boston Marathon bombing happened here, it brought our city so much closer. There's that initial period, and this is not the same event, obviously. There's that initial period of uncertainty, what's going on, who's in charge. But then it's sort of led by like this realization of like, we can't get out of this unless we sort of do this together. I was about to say hold hands and do it together, but maybe at a distance. But yeah, I mean, right. Like aside from like a lot of the people who are sick and infected and dying, I think this is actually a great opportunity for a lot of us. With that being said.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a huge awakening last night. I was talking to my daughter. She's 17 years old, and high school graduation this year. And of course, no high school graduation, right? High school is canceled now. And as I was talking to her, she was like, Dad, she was like, my age group, the class of 2020, has been shaped by destiny. And I was like, and that was, to me, was a big term for her. And I'm like, well, why is that, Lauren? And she was like, I was born right after 9/11. I was born right after 9/11. We are the class that is the first class to graduate only knowing war. These 17-year-olds have only known war. And like we were defined when there weren't airplanes flying around right after 9/11. And here we are again on the eve of my graduation, and there's hardly any airplanes flying around. And it was like, wow, holy cow. And she was like, we will be resilient out of this. These are these two huge bookmarked, defining moments for our bookended, defining moments for her teenage years. But yet she's just going to come out strong, like you say. But I think it's interesting too that this is the time to emerge, right? I always tell people like leading and leaders and leadership, that's a verb. That's an action word. You have to, leading is with action. You can't just say you're a leader and everything. I'd be really interested to know, because you wear a dual hat. You are known as an influencer, and you referred to many influencers out there in the social media world, but and you view yourself as a leader too. This is I think, a very relevant topic. That could you, I guess, explain to me, like the difference between the two from your point of view?
Yeah, absolutely, man. This is such a good question, and I've really sort of, in terms of like this whole influencer leader, how you're representing yourself on social media. I mean, it's something that I think I've always been thinking about, but I've really began talking about it maybe like since the last year and a half, and it's essentially like growing up, all the leaders, all the quote unquote role models that I thought I had weren't actually role models. And that's because I don't really think that, looking at a picture of, I don't know, LeBron James playing basketball and like being, oh my God, he's such a good basketball player, I want to be like him. I think that's great and everything. But aside from if LeBron James actually is a leader or not, I'm way more focused on the perception of how he's perceived as a leader or not. And what I mean is this. So a lot of us, we look at whether it's leader or influencer or someone who has a certain amount of followers or has a certain amount of money as like this ultimate leader that we should be following. And I think that there is a massive injustice in the lack of transparency and how someone can like idolatrize and become absolutely fascinating with someone and think that because they're your role model or because they have this certain amount of money or followers, there's nothing wrong with them. They're a perfect human being that has no problems. And then when you look at that and then you compare that to yourself, everyone for the most part knows sort of like the totality of their own character, like all of their own problems and all of their own issues and all these things that make us human. And so when someone compares that with sort of this I would say, broken lens of perception, you can't really be a leader. You can't really be an influencer. And so I feel like a real leader, a real thought leader is someone who stands up for a movement and doesn't say like, hey, you should follow me because I have this kind of body, or you should follow me because I have this amount of money, or you should follow me because I look like this, or because I'm so successful. Real thought leaders are people who say, hey, you should follow me, or at least have a conversation with me, because I've been in the same issues that you've been in now. And I had to create my own path and guide myself out of that. And now I'm guiding people through the realities of life, not just the sort of picture perfect stance. And I think a big part of this has to do with just like the evolution of media. Media started off, whether it was in the newspaper or it was on TV, and it was highly, highly edited, highly polished. You had actors and actresses. Everyone was wearing like the best outfits, the best makeup. And so I feel like now when it comes to social media, people are still trying to do that, when that, I think, alienates a big portion of the people who you're actually trying to reach. And so for me, like, I'm just being honest. Like, whether it's me posting on my podcast or on LinkedIn, I'm just honest about my problems. And I don't expect people to follow me or to subscribe to my podcast because I'm some perfect expert and that's why they should hire me or listen to my podcast or whatever. I'm just a normal dude that's trying these things, and I'm just honest about my mistakes. And by doing that, and by highlighting my mistakes, it almost gives people an illuminated path to rise and to see themselves in that influencer, in that thought leader that can actually give them hope and actually, make them a real human being.
Yeah, I think that creates just this huge, it's about trust, right? If you're your authentic self, you're going to have many people disagree with you. You're going to have many people not care the message that you're carrying, all of those things. But if you're authentic, then the people that decide to follow you, and I don't mean social media follow, but literally, right, from a leadership perspective or something, if they choose to follow you, it's built off of that trust because they see that authenticity. And that's what really counts. And I think that's, from someone that's a digital immigrant and not a digital native, that sometimes when you see some of these influencers, that they're inauthentic and you can just see it's blatant, and you would never view them from a leadership point of view. They still may be an awesome influencer. There still may be something that you like about them, but you would never follow them blindly because you just know they're not their authentic self. And I think that's just one of the cornerstones of being a great leader. Is just to be authentic, and people will feel that. I think there's a tangible, feeling that you can get from high trust.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, ultimately, if someone doesn't trust you, then they're not actually going to hear your message. And I know for me, one of my goals is that, I'm not whenever someone calls me an influencer, I cringe because it is to me, I have seen I've seen the word go, in so many different places, especially when it comes to kind of the negative connotation. But it's for me, what my goal is I'm when I post content and I'm trying to attract the following, or trying to build a base, what I'm really trying to do is I want people to not think of me as someone they just found on social media, and to think of me the same way that, they might think about, one of their friends that they haven't seen in 3 months in their head. And so that's my entire goal. And so whether that's, me hosting a podcast so people can listen to, not just my words, but also, my guests who are usually much smarter than me when they're at the gym or when they're driving. And I can almost just sort of be there for them in whatever sort of digitally distributed, accessible way that I can. And so that for me is the best point, without sort of distorting that, because I feel like if you go too heavy in the digital lens and you go in the wrong way, then I feel like it can alienate you even more, and people can just sort of see you as a robot. in terms of like, oh, this is just some guy who, posts on his LinkedIn every day, just like sales pitches to get people to sign up for this thing or that thing.
Yep.
And so, and so, of course, I'm not saying selling people is wrong, but there's just a right and a wrong way to do it. And so for me, like, I would rather sort of build a relationship with someone online, whether it's through social media or the book or the podcast or however they find me, over the course of like 10 years than to get them to sign up for like my LinkedIn course in like a second. And so that for me is sort of my goal. And so for me, like, a big reason why I even host my podcast and why I call it Humans 2.0 is because, there's so many topics that I could talk about. And I've had on my podcast, whether it's an entrepreneur or a billionaire entrepreneur or a professional athlete or a celebrity chef, it's that human denominator that sort of attaches all of us together, and that desire to try to learn and do a little bit better, whether you are a CEO or a CPA or a janitor. And so for me, that's kind of my goal, because I know 10 years from now, those people, whether it's they have kids or they have, grandkids, and let's say they do, they've been listening to my podcast for 10 years, or I come out with a book, then for sure they're way more likely to sort of bring it more to heart because they trust me, and then to also spread the word out there to people that know that I could potentially help with my book, podcast, and all the other stuff that I do.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think some of the terms that I use a lot is human-centric leading and all that, and it just boils down to humans and about how to, I think everybody should be on a journey to understand what makes people tick, because if you can, right, we're all humans at the end of the day, and that's who you've got to figure out. And I know that you have discovered a lot of things on your own personal journey that I want to talk about also, but I'll give you a fascinating analogy in terms of what you were just talking about that affected me yesterday. That was real important. I was looking at work, and I was going through LinkedIn on a break kind of thing. And as I'm scrolling through there, you see the 500 people giving, how to work at home, and, this is how you manage stress, and everybody's good-willed, right? There's good intentions, but you can tell that some people are trying to commercialize that too, right? And 100%. Everybody's doing that. And then all of a sudden I scrolled, to this one person, and they were just like, hey, I just want to offer one bit of advice. Go give blood. That was it. That was their advice. The blood banks are running out of blood donors right now because everybody's locked in and all that stuff. And they were just like, go to the Red Cross, go give blood. And that, to me, that's leadership, right? You don't have your, these are the 10 points to get through surviving virtual, conferencing, and then they're like, and if you need a new phone to virtual conference, call me, Instead, this person took their time and just said, go give blood. And I love that, right? Because that's, I think, what you were talking about before. That's the stop in your tracks realization on, wow, that person's authentic. That's a real leader. They're using, their influence for good. And it's a very simple message that's unselfish, right? It's servant leading. It's just saying, go do the right thing, people. And I love that. I love those type of people out there, because I think that's the true art form of leading. And it affects humans, right? It affected me on, like, I was thinking about it all day today. I was like, I wonder if I can find time in my calendar today to go give blood. That's all I thought about. And I didn't think about the 10 steps to virtual working, so it's kind of interesting. So Mark, I kind of in terms of, the crisis that we're in and everything, you've also, by fate and destiny, you've actually had a book, and this is your first book you've written, right? Has been released to the public in the last week or so, and the title of it, Screw Being Shy: Learn How to Manage Social Anxiety and Be Yourself in Front of Anyone. I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the points in your book. When you think about it from a social anxiety point of view, and you might have, and I don't want to be putting words in your mouth, but like, I think there's 1,000 times more anxiety going on in today's environment over the last few weeks because of the pandemic that's going on, that potentially You know, people that didn't normally experience anxiety now are experiencing anxiety, fear of the unknown, all of those kind of things. I'd love to know from your own life, your own journey, your experience with dealing with social anxiety, and the perception of being an introvert, and all of those kind of things, and how you relate that not only into your own story, but maybe some things that you could talk to our listeners about how to recognize what anxiety is, and kind of how to defeat it. How do you defeat it?
Yeah. So to that question of how do you recognize anxiety, it's a super interesting conversation to have, because there's this I don't know if you've heard it, but there's this analogy of like two goldfish in a bowl, and one goldfish says to the other, hey, how's the temperature of the water? And the other goldfish says, wait, what are you talking about? What's water? And so these two fish are completely surrounded. They live inside of water at all times in their lives, and it's invisible. Yeah. And yet, if one goldfish, let's say, tries to go above water, it can't. And so this water is limiting its behavior without it even knowing. And so for me, when I was growing up and I had anxiety due to a variety of reasons, I had no idea this was actually happening. And so a major part of quite honestly any element of life is like, if you're constantly surrounded by this, whether it's a serious issue or whether it's not, it's going to blend into the background. And
you're
like the ultimate, yeah, absolutely. And like the ultimate way that I kind of, not only just learned this through my experience, but also I remember interviewing a world Olympian, and he actually came out of one of the countries that was sort of broken down after the Soviet Union. And he grew up in the Soviet Union. And he was telling me when he was a kid, he had no idea he was living in a communist country. He had no idea. And so he told me, like, your mind has the ability to familiarize anything if it's that common and it just sort of is built into the background. And so that honestly is how I would describe like my anxiety experience. And so a major part of like why I sort of lived in this mode of my life for a decade was because I had no idea. And when you have no idea, then you start to think that it's your fault. And so for me, when I had social anxiety, and for me, like I would even define myself as a pretty sociable person, but I had social anxiety. And so every time that I wanted to talk to somebody and my nervous system would stop me or my brain would talk me out of it, I remember going home basically almost every single night for a solid 10 years of my life and just regretting so many decisions of like, oh man, I wish I could have sort of said what I really wanted to say to that person in that conversation. Or, I regret, or I regret maybe saying something impulsive because I was nervous, because I had social anxiety. And so, to sort of get in this, like social anxiety is not you being afraid to ask a girl to the prom. That's totally normal. And so like to back up here, it's like being an introvert, there's nothing wrong with being an introvert.
Sure.
I think that there are introverts and there are extroverts. And I think, yeah, you could be some middle ground of that. But I mean, ultimately, there's so much confusion around that in and of itself. When you actually look at the definition, an introvert is defined as someone who predominantly, like how their brain works, their brain has a tendency to focus more on the internal world, thoughts, emotions, feelings, themes, and they get energy from them. And so, and there's also, when it comes to being shy, you could also have a totally normal, healthy level of being shy in terms of like, if you do something for the first time, or maybe you're talking to somebody for the first time and, like the first minute, you're shy. That's totally normal. But there are people who, eventually fall into a pattern of being shy in every situation, in every environment, no matter who they have to talk to. And if that's perpetuated long enough, it becomes social anxiety. And oftentimes, like, social anxiety is not, it's not like a random thing that happens, like being an introvert, like being born that way. That's something that's basically random. But having social anxiety, that's not random. Often a very specific thing happens in someone's life that can trigger that. And so the onset of social anxiety is usually around like 10, 11 years old, but there's also cases of adults getting it when they're like 30, 40. And so for me personally, the way that this unfolded was, like you said, my parents immigrated to this country, America, from Egypt. And, we mostly lived in the city in Boston, where I live in Massachusetts. And when I was about in second to third grade, we ended up moving out into a much smaller town with 5,000 people. And so the really interesting part about this town was there was no racial diversity in this place whatsoever. And so basically me and like one or two other people in the entire school looked different than everyone else. We were the only people who weren't Caucasian, who weren't white. And also at this time, this was post 9/11. And so the whole sort of Middle Eastern brand and perception was really tanking. And so, for me, I faced a tremendous amount of like extreme racism, a tremendous amount of bullying, abuse. And eventually that just put my brain in this mindset of everyone in life hates me. I should not talk to anybody. And also at that time, I also began to develop physical health issues, a lot of issues that, I see a lot of kids in America today face, like asthma, ADD, issues with my skin, stomach, appendix, bladder, sleep. All these things just sort of came, and in turn, it made me a lot physically weaker. I had no physical energy. And so it was a combination of a lot of these factors of, I was in a terrible environment, and then also the fact that nobody around me physically looked like me. And so it really gave me this perception that I was just an isolated loner. And so for me, I had social anxiety, and I was stuck in this mentality for 10 years. And, despite this, it's super interesting because, social anxiety, it first forms in your mind. And so like you'll be in a room or a classroom or a meeting, and, your mind will start to be like, oh, did that person just look at me weird? Wait, why did that person just look at me weird?
The voice in your head. This voice in your head.
The voice in my head. Yeah, the voice in my head. And the really interesting part is like, we all have a voice in our head, but a lot of us don't actually know. And so for me, I had no idea. I was never really conscious of my thoughts. And a friend of mine, Jeff Warren, he actually has a quote, and he says, he says, meditation teaches you that you have a voice in your head. And so for me, when I was like 19, when I started to meditate, I had no idea. And so when these things are happening, you're just like, wait, I'm actually going to believe these thoughts, even though they may not necessarily be true. And so someone with social anxiety, like, they'll go down this whole line of like thinking that they have to do something, they have to try extra hard, or they have to compensate, or else somehow everyone is going to find out about how they have social anxiety and make fun of them or judge them. That's what social anxiety is. Social anxiety is not just you being nervous when it comes to communicating to other people, but it's also a perceived deficiency in someone's social skills or their physical appearance or their entire character that makes them feel like they have to try super hard to make up for it, or else everyone will find out. And so when you have social anxiety, it starts off in your mind. It starts off with that voice in your head. It starts telling you, oh man, what's happening here? Does that person hate you? All these different, perhaps, thoughts that are right and some thoughts that are not right. And it could be just literally social delusions. And so what will happen is when you go down that line of thinking, if you're conscious or unconscious about it, then your body begins to feel the physical signs of anxiety, which is, your forehead might start sweating, your palms, your legs might tapping. You might start tapping your leg. Your throat might clench up, it might tighten up, your mind might start racing. And then if you do need to talk, your mind will just go blank and you'll have no idea what to say and you just won't be yourself. And so that's usually what happens. And the real issue, James, is eventually you store this pattern of behavior because it happens so often into your body. And so what will happen is you will walk into a room or you'll walk into a meeting, and let's say you actually are not feeling any socially anxious thoughts, but your body and mind have already been beginning to form this cycle of social anxiety. And so what will happen is when you sit down in that same environment, your body will pick up on those cues and your body will start to show the physical symptoms of anxiety, of what I just said, of your forehead heating up, your legs start tapping. And then your mind will look at what your body's doing and it'll put you in that socially anxious state of mind. And so in turn, what happens is like someone with social anxiety might actually really want to talk to people, might actually be really social, but their nervous system and their brain is not letting them. And so this goes into a lot deeper aspects of life other than just like, oh, I'm shy or I can't talk to people. This eventually influences and impacts every area of your life. And for me, when I was kind of looking at this, and also when I was looking at the science and the data and the research, I realized that I have to write this book because what I found the most profound is social anxiety, at least in America, is the most common form of an anxiety condition. And on top of that, out of all of the other anxiety conditions, it is the most correlated with substance abuse and social isolation, both of which are heavily correlated to suicide.
Let me ask you this. If social anxiety is in a way, so I love the analogy of the goldfish, right? So I now can imagine you, I can visualize you being surrounded by water. And so if it's produced from your brain, it's your internal thoughts are doing this and you're having physical reactions. So these primal reactions being driven by your mental thoughts, right? How then do you start to recognize the fact that if this is really happening, right? All right, so you're swimming in the water, but then you just started to talk about these are some of the leading indicators. These are the top indicators for substance abuse and all of that. So what you were about to talk about, are they amplifiers? Or is drugs, alcohol, medication, bad behaviors, all that just amplifying the fact that you have continued to swim in the water, not realize it, and that it's your brain controlling all this, your thought processes?
Yeah, so this is it. So I actually don't necessarily think it's about your thought process. I think that's how you perceive it in your brain. Like you're getting these thoughts that tell you you're messed up or whatever. And then, when you even look at it, like the average human mind emits anywhere from 25,000 to 60,000 thoughts a day.
Yes.
And so some of these thoughts we are conscious of, we know we're thinking, and others we have no idea that we're thinking them and they're running at the back end, excuse me. And so the way that I view this is like when you give an actor a movie script and you're like, hey, say this, say that, say this, say that. You're basically building out the script of your life. And so for sure, thoughts can be extremely important to, your life and anxiety and all this stuff. But I think there is a much deeper thing, a realm. And that has to do with your psyche, your psychology. Okay. And so one of the major points that I bring out in this book is sort of the root cause of all of this. And that is psychological trauma. And so social anxiety is not like this random thing that happens to you the same way that you might have been born introverted. Social anxiety is something that happens to you as your body's psychological coping mechanism for something really bad that happened to you. And this is usually early on in someone's life. And so for me, like I mentioned, that was a lot of racism, a lot of bullying, a lot of abuse, to where the younger kid inside of me said, oh my God, life sucks. Life is so challenging. I didn't know this could happen. And so I'm basically going to respond in the world by putting my head down, by accepting the fact that I can't talk to people, by not making eye contact. And so everyone has a different version of this, even if it's not social anxiety. So for example, like you might be growing up and your dad is an alcoholic and he starts to beat you physically. So then that person going through that experience, they also face this psychological trauma where their nervous system comes up with a response. And for that person, it might be, hey, I'm going to go to the gym every day and get super physically strong so that nobody can hurt me again. And so what I've found is when you undergo this psychological trauma, what happens is your nervous system stops. Your nervous system is interrupted because our brain and body and mind is a learning machine. We are built to constantly learn things. And what happens is when your nervous system pauses, it's doing that because it's trying to learn, it's trying to process what just happened so that it can implement and move on with its life. And so for me, when that traumatic event happened from like 10 years old for me, and my body put myself in this psychological traumatic stress response, I was stuck in that for 10 years, because my nervous system was stuck in that spot. And so every time that someone like is even past that situation, their psychology will still react in the same way. And so for me, I was like, my traumatic experience, that happened for me in elementary school and in middle school. And by the time I was in high school, nobody was really bullying me. Nobody was really being racist to me. A lot of these kids had sort of had grown up, or I just stopped hanging out with them. But yet, that was probably when I was at my worst. And so a lot of the times, our nervous system is going to be paused, and it's going to be constantly creating these circumstances on the outside based on the sort of unmet lack of psychological response that we've had in our body. And so, for me, like when I was 10, 11 years old, maybe if I was put in a better environment, maybe if I was taking care of some other aspects of my physical and mental health, maybe I would have sort of grown and got out of it, rather than me being to the point where it happened in my life where I was 18 and my lifelong social anxiety turned into social isolation. I got seriously depressed for the first time in my life. I began to use all sorts of substances and food to cope with this. Eventually, I was over 200 pounds, and there was a point where I was sort of suicidal. And I kind of saw firsthand all these different data points that I referred to you. And so I think a lot of times, especially when you look at substance abuse, why that's the most correlated with social anxiety is because, and I see this a lot actually in the entrepreneur world. People, before they go to an event, they'll vape something or they'll smoke something, or when they walk into the event, they'll go straight to the bar to get some alcohol to change their state of mind. And I think we just have more pull to artificially change our state of mind because we're constantly stuck, especially in social situations, between like this mental prism that makes us not actually who we are. And so when you're able to relieve that pain through some sort of a substance, it can give you that freedom for a certain period of time. But oftentimes, drugs are not healthy. Alcohol is not healthy for you. And so a lot of these things will bring your health even down. And then on top of that, every time that you do that, that's giving a signal to your brain to search for a Band-Aid solution. When in reality, and I talk about this a lot in my book, it's like a lot of this is understanding like the root cause, the deep neuroscience behind this, and then like a practical framework to do this every single day, because this is not something that you can solve overnight or by vaping or drinking something. And so that's sort of to it. I think, did I answer your question?
Yes, but I want to go a little deeper because to understand this a little more. So you have a fundamental trigger point that starts this in a way down your journey of the social anxiety, and all those indicators. You're swimming in the water. Is there a trigger to make you recognize it at some point? So when you were 18, 19 years old and all this stuff, and even if you're at your worst moments, what was your personal moment? And then through your research, does it take another significant event to then go, whoa, what's happening? I'm swimming in water. Like what is the other side of it look like, the triggering event from the other side?
Yeah. And honestly, man, I'm so glad that you're asking me this question to get an answer, because I think this is actually this is like probably one of the most important things someone can realize by listening to a podcast, right? Like you might not get all the answers from life by listening to a podcast episode, but if you can hear something that makes you recognize something in your own life, then that's key. And so that can look like a lot of different things. And so I've had people like that have already read the book where I kind of talk about like what having social anxiety looks like, when I was talking to you about like the physical symptoms, how like your thoughts are moving. I mean, that could potentially be a sign for someone to realize like, oh, wait, that happens to me too. That's me. Does that mean I have social anxiety? But for me, this was really interesting. And so the way that I actually realized that I had social anxiety was when I was 18. And so like I told you before, when I was going through this, I had no idea this was happening. I was sort of stuck in that water. And then because of that, I thought that there was something inherently wrong with me and I messed up and so on and so forth. And so for me, the moment I actually realized this was a thing was when I went to my first college party and I got drunk. And when I got drunk, all of a sudden, because alcohol is a social lubricant, all of a sudden I could walk up to any guy, any girl and say whatever I wanted. And so I remember the next day being like, wait, like
what happened?
What literally just happened? And then it wasn't the fact that like I got drunk and it felt great, but I was just like, wait, why can't I do this all the time? Like, why can't I talk to people in general? And so for me, it was that almost contrast of being artificially inebriated and then realizing what it's like to not have social anxiety for a short amount of time. And so when I had that experience, I was like, oh my God, why can't I actually do this? And then that led me down the track of like Googling this, researching this, and actually finding out that it's a real legitimate thing. And so again, a lot of these sort of conscious moments can happen on accident, like this one that happened to me. But I think a real sort of way that people can go about this is by, one, kind of listening and hearing more stories of people who have experienced this problem. And then also, look at the boundary. Look at the fact that when the goldfish is swimming in water, why can't it get out of the water? And so for me, what I realized was whether it was a boundary in like my social life or my emotional life or my business life, I realized that I had so many boundaries around my life that were just sort of naturally seemed like they were sort of just created. And it was actually self-imposed, and it was actually due to my social anxiety. And so I think that's a major way that people can do it. And then also what I would also say is this. So another thing that sort of happened to me when I was in this moment was I remember I was actually involved when I was in high school. I wasn't the driver, but I was involved in a car accident. And I remember sitting in the back and I remember seeing like this massive truck just like slowly but surely slam into us. And I didn't see it from far away, but I saw it like happening a few seconds beforehand. And so when that happens, your body goes in this immediate fight or flight response. You're freaking out.
Right.
And so, I mean, it's hard to figure these things out in the moment, but I remember in hindsight, I was like, wait, right before that car was about to hit us and get into that car accident, my brain went into the same mode that I always go into at school or whenever I'm in a social gathering. And so I think it's seeing that moment of an experience, but sort of seeing what your nervous system does. Another way to look at this, the flip side is like, you could maybe do something that is like maybe considered positive in terms of like, for me, like when I went skydiving, for example, I saw that same response for my brain and body. And then once you put yourself through that, you realize that this is just sort of like a biochemical response that my brain is doing based on a feedback loop that my brain has been involved in throughout thousands of years of us evolving and moving around as humans through different industrial revolutions and whatnot versus the society we have today. And so those are a few ways that I think people can gain consciousness about that. But yeah, I mean, it's so important because I think that's the first step. Because until you're conscious of something, you can't actually do anything about it. So that's an unbelievable question. Thank you so much for asking.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for allowing us to kind of a peek into your own vulnerability to this, to, to expose your own personal life story so that others can learn from this too. And I know you touch on this a little bit more too. So how you enter it, some of those symptoms, and we just talked a little bit about recognizing it and almost an exit event so that you're aware of these trigger points. But you also have in your book some really good research into how you can start to rewire yourself on this, right? Through food and sleep, other biological tools, and you just said it earlier about how this is almost ancestral. It's primal. Some of these things are just built into the human body from thousands and thousands of years. And although it's certainly not going to be at this deep of a level, but we talked about it earlier, with the pandemic surrounding us, people are going to have levels of anxiety. What do you believe are some great tips and tricks, biohacks that people should fundamentally say, treat your body well through this better research and understanding to help you through these significant anxiety events and things like that?
Yeah, man. So honestly, I think like the biggest realization that I had that's helped me out the most is like, again, I'm a very spiritual person, and I don't mean to say this to get too like empirical, to get too black and white or too scientific, but I truly believe that the experience of each person's reality is a combination of our brain firing on different neurotransmitters and secreting different chemicals that have been in a feedback loop between the environment that are triggered. So, for example, our body has this thing called a circadian rhythm. And essentially, it's like this biological clock that syncs up with the sun. This is what tells us, like, hey, you should be sleeping now, you should be awake now. And so they found that, for example, like if you don't go outside, you don't access that sunlight, which is how your body receives that sign to start that feedback loop, then you can have some real problems with not just your sleep, but also your energy throughout the day. And so, for example, one thing is, one of the leading doctors on mental health, Dr. Daniel Amen, has said that the correlation between every single mental health problem, not just social anxiety, but also anxiety and some other kind of like more serious mental health problems too, is a deficiency in vitamin D, which is you get by going outside in the sun. And so, I mean, that's one of them. But I say this realization because I really did realize that whether it's a specific thought or a mood or a feeling, these are all brain chemicals. These are all things that my brain is creating and firing. And so with that, like maybe overly simplistic approach, what I really found in my research is in the mental health community, and then also like in the leadership communities, there's often a lot of talk on a key neurotransmitter called serotonin. And serotonin does a lot in our body and functions a lot. And it has to do with things from our mood regulation to regulating our appetite to our sleep to regulating our function in social groups. And so this specifically in terms of social anxiety is great, but it's also great for just a lot of mental health, different issues, especially anxiety in general. And so when you look at serotonin, for maybe about 20 years ago, most of the leading scientists and researchers were assuming that because it's a neurotransmitter, it's got to be in our brain. And it turns out the last 10, 15 years have actually proved the opposite of that. And they've actually found that only 5 to 10% of serotonin is in our brain. The rest, 90 to 95% of serotonin is not in the brain. And it's actually in this ecosystem of bacteria called the gut microbiome between our stomach and intestines that have literally formed a symbiotic relationship with human beings thousands of years ago that I think has made us the number one species on our planet. And so our gut microbiome is affiliated with so many different functions and different parts of our biology that make various processes in our body happen. And there's a nerve that directly connects the gut microbiome to our brain called the vagus nerve. And so down my research, I found that if your gut is not in symbiosis, which is two organisms working together, then it has a chance to be in dysbiosis. And what happens when your gut is in dysbiosis, this creates the foundation for many, many mental health problems, and then also many other chronic illnesses like diabetes to a lot of autoimmune disorders. And so it's not just about mental health. And so the two biggest ways that your gut microbiome can enter into dysbiosis is one, an extreme amount of stress. And this ties back to what I said before of psychological trauma. And so our body is very much a very connected system. You can't really isolate an organ or isolate this part and say, oh, the problem is with this. The matter of the fact is, like, for example, when I kind of face that psychological trauma, an insane amount of stress, and in turn, your nervous system pauses, which creates chronic stress on a daily basis.
Yes.
That will put your gut microbiome in dysbiosis. The number two cause of dysfunction in your gut microbiome, which is where all of your serotonin is mainly produced, is your dietary choices. And so one thing I want to say is, there's no such thing as a universal healthy diet. There's no such thing as everyone's got to be eating keto, everyone's got to be eating this. The matter of the fact is the one universal diet is just eating natural whole foods. The real fad diet is what's happened over the last 50 to 100 years with food manufacturers and convenience stores and junk food and soda and all this stuff that has really hijacked the average American's biochemistry that makes them addicted, that makes them tired, that creates the foundation for mental disease to pop up. And so I would say probably the most profound thing is like, and the really interesting thing apart this is like, I was just doing a podcast beforehand, and it was from someone who's actually in the UK. And I told him that, like, did you know that the European Union has banned over 500 ingredients from food manufacturers and companies putting them into their food? And yet, if you walk into any grocery store, any convenience store today in America, you're going to see all those ingredients out with no problem, no warning, no nothing. And so, like I talk about this in the book. I mean, there are studies that have correlated like artificial food dyes, like red 6, yellow 5, blue 40, like whenever you buy junk food and you turn over the ingredients and it's like an entire essay of like just ingredient after artificial ingredient after things that you don't recognize. I mean, there have been studies that have found that causes ADD in children in Europe. And the craziest part about this is that the same exact companies, I'm not going to name any, the same exact companies that are banned from doing this in Europe, they're the same companies that are making these same foods, but in like the American format way that's much cheaper to produce. And so that to me is terrible. And I mean, I go into just a lot of studies in my book that correlate, hey, if you're eating the American standard diet, which is mostly processed food, soda, a lot of alcohol, your brain is not only going to physically be smaller, but you also have an exponentially increased chance of developing depression or anxiety down the road. And so for me, I view mental health and anxiety and depression as sort of two sides of the coin. One of them is what we've sort of been talking about before of like, if you're not living the truth of your life, if you're not actually living as your authentic self, yeah, you're going to have problems. If you're not, if you haven't defined your values and you're doing the opposite of them unconsciously, yeah, you're going to be pretty miserable. And then I think the other half of it is biochemistry. The other half of it is what I've just been saying, because the matter of the fact is, I kind of view this conversation in terms of software and hardware. Software is the mindset, the thoughts, the positive or negativity, the books you read, the podcasts you listen to. And then the hardware is whatever that software is running on. And so your mindset, your mind is housed in a physical organ called your brain. And so the analogy that I make in my book is like, you could have the best software. You could have the best version of iOS from Apple. You could have like iOS 13 or 14 or whatever they're on now. And you could be trying to hit that install button on like an iPhone 2, the slowest, most outdated piece of hardware. And it's like, there are people today, and especially people who are self-quarantined, who are sitting inside and they're trying to brute force. They're trying to repeatedly tap that install button, and they keep getting these error codes. And so if you can begin to work on your hardware and software synergistically and realize that one impacts the other, then you're going to get a lot farther. And like a lot of people ask me today of like, have you had like a, I don't know what the word is, but have you had like a rebound on your mental health? Like, have you found yourself back in those really negative states? And it's like, I mean, for sure, not every day for me is perfect. I still have my own problems. I'm just like everyone else. I have bad weeks, but I have yet to see like a drastic impact on my mental health that, quite frankly, has lasted more than several hours. And so I think a big part of that is because I take super good care of my biochemistry, and I realize that this is a real foundation that then I know if I'm taking care of my neurotransmitters, if I'm taking care of my brain chemicals, then my thoughts are going to be much better. Then my energy is going to be much better. Then the way that I interact with people is going to be much better. And when you have energy, when you're really working on yourself at this biochemical level, then you're going to be able to simply be yourself in situations where most people cannot. And what I'm saying is like, again, let's say you have the best software. You're a great person. You have great values. You're mostly positive for most of the time. But let's say you're at an event, and let's say 3 p.m. comes along, where let's say you didn't have the healthiest lunch, and you're facing a real crash in your energy and your blood glucose level. So then now let's say someone walks up to you and tries to have a conversation with you at this event. You may not be as open or friendly or as inquisitive or as curious or as introspective or as thought-provoking as you normally would if your brain and body was functioning at an optimal level. And so for me, that's what I've really decided to focus on. But then, of course, there's both sides to that, right? Like I mentioned in my book, it's like, you could be going to the gym all day. You could be eating all the broccoli and all the kale, and you could still hate your life if you haven't tackled some of these other issues. So it's a super important conversation. And I think if someone focuses on this, they're going to be able to like control the 80%, to be able to focus on this 20% that's going to get them 80% of the results. That's the way that I view sort of nutrition and our biochemistry.
Yeah, Mark, you are so spot on, and thank you so much for sharing that. And we go back to this human-centric thing, and it is so amazing when you do it mind, body, software, hardware. I love that, by the way. It's amazing when I talk to leaders and I consult with them from a leadership perspective. One thing that I tell them is the one thing that you can change immediately is their level of resilience. All these senior leaders, they have high education and training and experiences, and they're trying to find out, how can I move the needle? How can I be different than my peer? Well, their peer has the exact same amount of education, training, experiences, right? But where you can move the needle, each person has this individual control today, is that they can concentrate on resilience, right? Like, when you say resilience, for me, the 4 pillars of resilience is physical resilience, and that's where you were just talking about the diet. And if you just think about this, that by diet, nutrition, and exercise, by paying attention to that, how much you can really move the needle, because you can start to think clearly, defog yourself, all of those things. Another example on the physical side is just, there was a Department of Defense study, I think it came out in 2011, and they had done autopsies on those that committed the act of suicide in the Department of Defense. And like 80% of those unfortunate incidents, the humans were omega-3 and vitamin D deficient.
Oh my God, dude.
And yeah.
Oh my God.
And so what they started to show was by simply taking omega-3 and vitamin D supplements, it's the happy pill combination. Like it starts to defog you, right? In a physical sense. So physically, by paying attention to what you eat, and I got a great story about one more thing too. I went nutritarian at the beginning of the year, and just, solid whole foods, right? Nutrient dense foods. And Mark, it's amazing, right? It's literally like night and day how your body reacts to it, but how your brain reacts to it also. And just how you start to realize your primal self, the primal being is craving the right things finally, and all of that. So that's a huge pillar of resilience. Mental is everything we just talked about. And social, that it's amazing to me how important it is to have that social resilience and everything you talked about, by having the opposite end with social anxiety, but the importance of recognizing it so you can have it. And you mentioned also what I'm a big believer into is that spiritual side of resiliency. And it doesn't have to be religious, right? It just means being, believing in something bigger than yourself. But by having all of those things tied in together, anybody that's listening to us now can change their lives with no drugs, nothing fundamental. You don't have to have a gym membership. You don't have to, read 5,000 things. You just pay attention to those very simple things, eat the right things, do the right things, and you can change the needle. And sleep. This is something that I blew past.
So important.
It's amazing to me. And I'd love to know, you talked a little bit about it, but what do you think is the biggest takeaway, your one biggest nugget of information when it comes to sleep that you've learned in your research? What is the thing you think when it's sleep? Is it amount of hours, quality of sleep? How do we tell people right now, look, you're stuck at home, you're on your devices, and then you try to force yourself to sleep, and it's, high anxiety, things like that. How do we get them down? How do we sleep them?
Yeah. So first and foremost, Jim, I just want to thank you, because right now I'm kind of freaking out because I just looked up the study that you just mentioned. And this is I'm definitely gonna put this in the second edition of my book, because I had no idea. And this is so profound. And I already had a study that was showing omega-3s and how they can prevent depression and anxiety, but this is brilliant. So thank you so much on that.
You bet.
And honestly, Jim, sleep, for literally all my life, I've been a terrible sleeper. I have memories of me being 12 years old and literally not falling asleep, and literally just trying to close my eyes and then being awake for 8 hours. And the next thing I know, I hear my parents' alarm clock go off, and it's the next day. And if I did fall asleep, I had a major problem with, quite frankly, wetting the bed, because what would happen was when I would fall asleep, when you fall asleep, that is the one time in our lives where it's just you and your brain. You have no distractions, you have no cell phone, you have no TV. And when you're against those thoughts, when you're against that psychological trauma that you haven't dealt with, your body is going to go into a fear, fight or flight response. And so you look at people who have been into an accident or some traumatic event, they usually pee themselves. And so literally for my entire life, I either did not sleep, or every time I did fall asleep, I wet the bed up until I was like 18 years old. So not just as a kid. And so for me, sleep was a major, major aspect. So of course, if you're eating like crap, that's going to destroy your sleep, right? And so, of course, eat a whole natural whole foods diet. Make sure that you're eating well-balanced meals. To me, I would, limit things like sugar. I think sugar is probably the biggest gateway drug, actually, that gets people into anxiety and into lack of sleep. Caffeine, try not to drink like 6 cups of coffee during the day. Try to drink just 1 in the morning. And then honestly, man, I mean, I kind of view sleep the same way. Of one half of it is kind of psychological with your thoughts, and then another half of it is sort of biochemically with like food and all this stuff. So I talk about this method in my book that kind of marries both of them. And so what I talk about is, a major part of how our brain operates are brain waves. There are different kinds of brain waves, and during sleep, our brain enters into a different kind of brainwave than our normal brain waves when we're in our waking conscious state. The number one thing that I could tell somebody is there's this technique called sleep anchoring. And essentially what you do is you're trying to almost create and you're trying to speed up your brain getting into these sleep waves artificially by yourself through a technique. And so this is what you do.
Okay.
You close your eyes, and every time that you inhale, like through your nose or through your mouth, choose a vowel sound. So it could be ah. And what you do is you play that in your head. So you don't say it out loud, but every time that you inhale inside of your head inaudibly, you play that sound. And then every time that you exhale, you choose a different vowel sound. So let's say it's ooh. So I inhale, I say ah in my head, and then I exhale and I say ooh in my head again. And so if you do that, you're probably going to fall asleep in less than 5 minutes. And
holy cow.
If someone, I mean, this sounds so overly simplistic. Most people don't try it, but if you do it, you're going to notice that in the first 3 minutes, you are going to immediately become drowsy, and you're going to step in that half awake, half dream state. And a lot of people, because they don't have, they haven't worked on their mental focus, a lot of the times what will happen is someone will do sleep anchoring, and they'll do it for like 2-3 minutes, and their brain will get super drowsy. And then that will disrupt the ah and the ooh, the sleep anchoring activity itself. And they will like kind of fall half asleep, and then they'll wake up and because they haven't been able to do it. But if you're able to focus and actually do this for like 5 minutes, you're going to knock out immediately.
Amazing.
It's extremely powerful.
Well, I challenge everybody listening to this to try that tonight when they hear this. It's for sure, because I know I sure am. That is amazing.
Yeah,
Thank you for sharing that technique. That is awesome. Well, Mark, I can tell you, I started off kind of the episode with saying, I'm a believer in fate and destiny, and, there's reasons why people are brought together at certain times and all of that. And I will tell you, I think we are all thankful for you being able to share your insights with us today, because they are timely and they're everlasting too. This is something that you do no matter what period you are in your life or in history or anything, but I think they're amplified right now by kind of where we sit today in the global pandemic. So I'd love to leave our listeners with this thing. I was looking at some of your book reviews. It's so brand new, right? But there's hundreds of reviews already on the people that quickly gobbled it up and read it and everything. And I think this is important. I read one and it said, "This book is a remarkable guide to building quality relationships, improving your sense of well-being, and making impact on the world." And I think you have certainly done that with us today, Mark.
Thank you, man. And yeah, I mean, that's really awesome. I mean, I've had, if you go look at my book on Amazon under the editorial review section, I mean, I've had so many awesome people, authors that I look up to, whether it's Daniel Pink, New York Times bestselling author of When, or Nir Eyal, or any of the, or clinical psychologists or organizational psychologists promote my book. And so, yeah, I mean, it's true. I'm super grateful for it. And yeah, I mean, I definitely recommend people to for sure check out the book if this is of interest. And yeah, I mean, the book is a lot about social anxiety and being shy and how to be yourself in front of other people. But quite frankly, I would also say it is for entrepreneurs who are just looking to upgrade their mental health too. There's a lot of things that someone can apply in here, even if they are not shy or they're not introverted or they're not socially anxious. So, Jim, thank you so much for having me on. This is a killer critical conversation, man. I could tell that so many podcasts I go on, the hosts just run through questions or they just sort of go down what I would sort of expect from them. And you did not do this. And so I just want to sort of commend here and acknowledge you for being a great podcast host. This has been a fantastic interview, man.
Oh, great, Mark. I appreciate that. It's not often I get red-faced, and I sure am right now. So I appreciate that. That's good stuff. But I think we both are on this journey to just show in a great light what it's like to lead and to follow, to be a mentor, a coach, to be an inspiration. Because at the end of the day, we're all humans. This is an interconnected global community. This pandemic has showcased that and amplified it. And we need more people like you to just continue to do the great work that you're doing. So thanks again, Mark.
Of course. And we need more people like you to do what you're doing too.
Awesome. Thanks. Thank you, man.
Awesome, dude.
Thanks for joining our leadership movement this week. Talking to Mark about so many of the relevant topics of today and our current situation in life was certainly timely, and I hope we all are a little better for the time we spent listening today. Don't forget our show notes are posted on the website with key leader takeaways and suggested action plans for you. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and tell a friend so we can continue to build our tribe. Join our Facebook group to get even more behind-the-scenes action and exclusive content for leaders. Until next time, remember that iron sharpens iron. Make yourself and others around you better every day.